So you guys really liked Sound Design September, and I have to mix an album. So what about March Mixing Madness? Hello everybody, welcome to this new series that I'm starting for the month of March. As I said, I have an album to mix and I'm sure that I'm going to be picking up many different tricks. So every day I just want to show you guys different little tricks that I'm doing in one of my mixes. And that will be happening for the next 30 days, but today I want to mainly talk about what you can expect from a mixing session. And to do that, I'm kind of going to continue where I left off in the last video that I did about mixing, and that is at the start of a mixing process. As you can see, a lot of the tracks in here are still muted, and essentially what I've unmuted is the bass line, the drums, and the kick drum over here. And right now what I'm doing is I'm just slightly trying to balance the kick and bass with each other and all of the drums on top of that, before I get into adding all of the sequences and all of the other material that actually turns this into a finalized track. So right now I'm just going to go through a bunch of the different areas, a bunch of the different combinations of drums, a bunch of the transitions for the kick and bass, and just trying to get the balance of the kick and bass and all of the drums right. And then what I'll probably move on to is some of the main elements, which are mainly going to be some of the sequences here, some of the more prominent one-shots, and then some of the vocals as well. And I'm just unmuting them one at a time, evaluating what they need to do in terms of where the element needs to be placed in the mix, and then making some slight adaptations to actually get it there. So for example, over here, we have a little bit of compression as well as corrective EQing, which is opened up over here, mainly to remove some of the transient. And then secondly, what I've done up until this point is on the open hat, I've added a little bit of dimension expander just to get some early reflections. And then I've added the gate to keep the hat in check. And this would be the kind of trick that I would go for in actually one of the next videos that is going to come up. So just to show you what this is doing, if we go to a place where the open hat is playing, you might hear this very subtle kind of sharpening of the hat here, mainly because we are removing essentially the tail of the hat. And what this means is that we're slightly redefining the groove of the track, because it's going to be a little bit sharper, it's going to be a little bit less precise and a little bit less relaxing. And of course, throughout time, with all of the small changes that you're making, that is part of the whole idea of mixing session, is that you're making these very small adjustments that can have a little bit of influence on the groove, a little bit of influence on the musical idea, how that is actually perceived. You know, just the volume between elements means that maybe one element can become a priority over another element or the other way around. And as somebody in the mixing mindset, these are the kind of decisions that you're going to be making for all of these different files that you see over here. Exactly where do they need to be positioned relative to all of the other ideas within the track. Now, of course, one of the things to keep in mind is that this is a track that I've produced and that I know, but I also do work with other people's material, be that from the label or be that from actual clients that approach me for a mixing session. And when it comes to their material, what I've noticed is that I really have different perspectives on the music than what they have. And that is essentially what you're buying when you're buying a mixing session. Is somebody's second opinion on, okay, all of these musical ideas, how would they work best together to convey an individual message to the listener? Now that is sounding very, very abstract, and in practice what it all boils down to is essentially just the fact that you may make different decisions on EQing, on volume, on dynamics, on all of that stuff that we're actually applying in the mixing phase here, or that you may have already applied in the production yourself. We're just kind of going to go through that once more and kind of saying like, no, I think this should maybe be a little bit more like this should maybe be a little bit more like that. The bassline needs a little bit more mid-range frequencies as opposed to sub, for example, or the hats maybe need to be sidechained or clipped a little bit differently to be extra groovy. Those are of course all like small individual decisions that the mixing engineer is making to overall change the idea of a track and kind of improve the presentation of the musical idea. And yeah, with the musical idea, I literally just mean all of the music that you have written, all of the like sound information that is in here, all of the storytelling that is in your track. Now, of course, in the next 30 days, I'm going to teach you a whole bunch of different tricks that should help you with finding all of those balances between the elements yourself. But if you're actually interested in working with somebody on your actual mix in order to get a new perspective, you're of course going to need to deliver those files to the mixing engineer. Now, most engineers probably have a document somewhere that explains how to do that, or they'll have a little piece on their website, or maybe even a video, something like this. So, you've decided to work with me on your next project. Nice, good choice. Now, both me and my studio are going to do our best in order to make your music sound as good as it can, but of course I'm going to need a few things from you in order to do that. So today, as you can see, I'm taking you behind the scenes a little bit inside of Reaper, where I'm going to be doing your mix. And as you can see, I have a track loaded up here. This is actually one of my own productions. And what you'll see is that I have every individual sound placed in its own unique file here. And that's what I'm going to need from you as well. I want you to export from your DAW every individual sound on its own track, such that when I put those files in the DAW, your track plays back in the exact same way. So that means that each individual sound is also positioned where it needs to be within the track, and I don't have to do any arrangement and that kind of stuff. And if you can see, if I scroll through this, you can see that that is achieved by having all of the tracks the exact same length and just covering the entire project when they're rendering out. Now, I cannot show this for every DAW, but for Ableton, the way that you do that is you can just select the tracks that you want to export. Say that I'm exporting all of the basses here. One of the things that you do have to keep in mind is that it's going to take all of the track names that you set over here and use that as part of the file name. But let's say that you have named those and you're very organized, unlike me. What you can do is you can click on the loop point over here to select the time that you want. And we're going to go to selected tracks only. I've included master and return tracks here. And then I personally turn on the normalize option, but I want you to turn that off because I want you to keep the original volume balance between all of the elements, so that your production is going to be the starting off point for my mixing session. And I don't have to rebalance all of the individual elements from scratch. Now, of course, you can just hit export and export wherever you want to. And this is going to generate a file for each of the individual tracks. Now, one of the cool things that you can see is that I've named all of my tracks with the group in which they belong. So I have a drum group, where you can see I have my kicks, my claps, and all of the other drums that are in my group. I have a basses group here. I have a sequences group. I have a one-shot group. You don't necessarily have to do this for me, as long as the naming scheme that you use does make a little bit of sense, not just random plugin names and that kind of stuff. The main thing that I'm personally interested in for all of my organization is this little tag over here, which is of course just the short description of the actual sound. Now, a final thing, most producers have that delay and their reverb on the tracks in the production, which is, in my opinion, the right thing to do because it's so important for the kind of music that we're making. But if you ever have some important sounds which feature a lot of delay and reverb, then it may also be handy to render them out dry, so that I can also work with a version that does not have that delay and reverb on it, and I can adapt it to the mix with my own delay and reverb instead. Finally, what I would also like is just a render of the full track in and of itself, so that I have a production mix that I can again reference and go off of to see where I can maybe make some more improvements and to see how I'm differing from the production mix with the decisions that I'm making. So that's everything that I need. I hope to get to the work on your project soon. Of course, if you have any more questions, you can always let me know, but thanks for watching this short introduction video of my mixing sessions. So as you can see, many different ways of getting information from your mixing engineer, from the person that you're working with on your track. And it's actually in your best interest to do that, because when it comes to the mixing engineer side of things, we are mainly looking for clients that are easy to work with. I like to be very open about this stuff because I think with a little bit of logical reasoning, you can come to the same conclusion anyway. So I might as well just straight up tell you. When I'm working with somebody else's track, there isn't really that passion for music like there is with your own music. Of course, it is very, very cool that I get to do this kind of stuff as a job and I still really enjoy it, but it's not the kind of passion that there is with something that you have created on your own. And one, this means that, of course, you're going to be making different decisions. You didn't spend 2 hours making that one synth, so you may put it more in the background than the person that actually made the synth. And this, of course, can be very good for deciphering what the mix actually needs. But it also means that when it comes to accepting a client, if I've worked with you in the past and you've been, to say, an annoying client, I would consider not getting work with you again. Now, I haven't had these kind of clients yet, so I cannot really talk about this in first-person experience, but I've heard a lot of people talk about what a kind of nightmare client is, and it's always kind of the same way, in that they don't really do any research on what you do beforehand, they don't do any research while the process is going on, they're very inactive on responding to you and that kind of stuff. And then when you are done with the mix, when you are delivering the final files that you need to deliver, then all of the revisions are coming in, and then all of a sudden they become very, very active and they want to say, oh, you want this change, I want to have that change, everything needs to be different. And that is actually something that I've worked with before in a little bit, in the sense that I did have one client which wanted really an enhancement of its own mix as opposed to having me do a mix for him. Most of their revisions were about, okay, how do I get what you've done with your mix and how do we get that back to what I was doing with my own mix? Even though I personally thought that what he was doing with the mix wasn't correct. And I made changes to it because I wanted to get away from what he was doing with his mix. But the reason why this happens is because I am not as passionate about that project as that person was. He has spent the whole time working on that project, listening to the project in that way. And when the project suddenly sounds different, when somebody else has put its hands on it, it can sound a little bit off, it can sound a little bit stranger. And especially the first listen is always going to sound strange. But what you need to do is you need to give it a few listens, maybe 2 or 3, to get used to just the fact that the track has changed, just the fact that the production is no longer yours. It's no longer the way you always heard it, the way you always imagined it. It's kind of similar to suddenly hearing a live performance of a track that you have always listened to in the studio performance. And then suddenly all of the inflections that you know and all of the little guitar scratches and all of the details of a track that you know are no longer there. And then suddenly it sounds like a strange track to you. That effect is, of course, going to come when you're mixing as well. But that doesn't mean that the mix in of itself is bad. It means that you just need to give it a little bit of time. See if the actual ideas have improved within the context. See if the things that you wanted to come out of the track are coming out more. And of course, don't be scared to get away from some of the ideas that you had with a sound in the production stage. Now, I want to finally circle around to doing your own mixes again, because there's a lot of people that just don't want to work with a mixing engineer. Part of it is, of course, you're going to have to pay a fee to work with a mixing engineer. But other parts is just that they want to mix their own tracks. Just like I want to mix my own productions, they want to mix their own productions too. And that is really good. And for those people, there's again going to be 30 more videos this month where I'm going to explain a whole bunch of different tricks. But the final thing that I want to circle back to is this idea of exporting stuff and then re-importing it into a different DAW like a mixing engineer would. And again, this is something that I covered in my last video about mixing, and that is really about getting off to a good start in the mix. What I want to talk about today actually happens in a different project in another mixing session that I just had. This is a first draft mix of the first track that I mixed from the album. And one of the things that you'll see throughout this mix is that I'm constantly cutting into different files. So here you can see I've removed a bar of drums. If I go back here, you can see I've removed some other drums here. I've removed some snares that are playing in this build-up area. But I'm sure if I go down, I can find some sequences where I've cut things. And I've moved things around. I've even duplicated over a sequence here, I believe. You can see this is happening twice. It was only playing in this part over here initially, and I've duplicated it over so that it started to play here. And as you can see, there's some other areas. There's some atmospheres, some effects in here, maybe some vocal. No, there doesn't seem to be any vocals. But you can also see on the sequence, there's some excessive filtering happening over here. And all of that kind of stuff is just there to reinterpret the musical idea. And on that last video, I got a question about, okay, if you find out that during the mix, the musical idea is just wrong, it just doesn't work the way that you imagined it, or it maybe works in the production mix, but once you get into the actual mix, it just doesn't work. The mix just doesn't allow for the musical idea that you have decided upon there. You still have some capabilities of changing that. So for example, this duplicating this over and having it start from here, it just sounded off like we suddenly had this extra layer coming in of extra high frequencies. So I decided to just take this part of the sequence and duplicate it over here. And that worked fine because I was only really using this to get the high frequencies out of it. Tonally, you can hear that over here, it sounds a little bit different going from the end of this file into the beginning of this file. But that doesn't really matter because once I've applied the effects that I needed to apply for this particular mix, you couldn't hear that effect anymore. And when it comes down to it, these files often leave you enough of a wiggle room that you can do these things. Again, a very common example is actually with the drums here, where you find out that, oh, the drums actually extend a bar too long for this part, or they're covering up the bass in this particular version of what I'm doing here. Whatever it may be that is happening, most of the time you can fix things in audio. What you cannot really do though in audio is you can continue producing. And that is really why I make the distinction between continuing producing and making changes to the musical idea as not being allowed whatsoever in a mix. In that in the last video, I really said that you're really trying to just take the musical idea that is there and make it into a track that is actually listenable. What I would argue with the files is that you're kind of in between in that you're not really making any significant changes to the musical idea. Yeah, you can really just change a place where the element is playing, but you're not going to change the element itself. You're not going to change the melody. You're not going to change the synth patch. You're not going to change the delay and the reverb that is already imprinted into this file. All of that is kind of final in a mix, and you're just kind of trying to adapt it. And yeah, maybe it does need to move a little bit in the structure in order for it to fit. But I would still consider that being part of the mixing process. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about for today. I'm honestly just rambling. I don't know how much of this footage is going to be actually usable, but I've recorded about 45 minutes of it. Sometimes I do like to get into these really long rambles on different things, and I don't really know what I'm saying at that point, and I'm just going to watch back in the edit and see if there's anything useful in it. Anyway, I hope that something useful does come out of it and that you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and make sure that you're subscribed. Another way that you can support me is, of course, by doing it financially. I have a Patreon for that, as well as YouTube memberships now. But of course, you can also check out my products, or maybe even my mixing services. Isn't that a cool idea? Mixing service shout out on the mixing video. Anyway, I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.